What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The person who kept me small at home tried to replace me at work, and the way I stopped it will change how you think about family loyalty forever. I never expected the spark would be lit at my own birthday dinner, but once the words were out in the open, there was no going back. The night was supposed to be simple. My parents had invited my boss out of courtesy because they thought it would be impressive to show him how family-oriented we all were. I already had mixed feelings about it, since mixing work and family has never ended well for me, but I went along because it was my birthday, and I did not want to fight over the guest list. For the first hour things were fine enough, the usual chatter about who bought what house, how the markets are doing, and what my cousin posted on Facebook. I sat there, nodding, quietly counting the minutes until I could get out without being the one blamed for ruining the vibe. And then Dad leaned forward, grinning like he had just won something, and said loudly, "You know, your sister Jenna is the star of this family. She always has been." He looked directly at my boss when he said it, as though my birthday had somehow turned into her achievement ceremony. That was already enough to make my jaw tighten, but I kept a straight face, because I have learned the hard way that reacting only fuels the performance. What I did not expect was my boss to raise an eyebrow and respond with a dry little laugh. "Funny, she has actually been asking me for an interview." The table froze. My dad chuckled like it was a punchline. Mom fumbled with the bread basket. And Jenna, for the first time that evening, lost her smile. She quickly tried to cover it with a sip of wine, but I saw the way her hand shook, and I knew. She had gone behind my back, reached out to my boss, and tried to slip herself into the very place I had worked years to build. And the fact that my father looked proud of her for it made the whole thing worse. I wanted to explode, to slam my hand on the table and demand an explanation, but instead I leaned back, forced my voice steady, and asked one clear question. When did she reach out? My boss, being the kind of man who prefers process to drama, said calmly, "A few weeks ago, actually. She sent me some notes that looked very familiar." He did not elaborate, but I knew exactly what he meant. My project notes, my own phrasing, my internal slide decks had been borrowed again. Jenna avoided my eyes, and Dad jumped in with a half-hearted, "She's just ambitious, honey, don't take it so seriously." That single line told me everything about the dynamic I had been trapped in for decades. My effort was invisible, her shortcuts were charming, and Dad was always ready to defend her. But I was not 16 anymore, and I was not going to play the quiet backup role in front of my own boss. So I smiled, lifted my glass, and said evenly, "Well, thank you for letting me know. Tomorrow I'll loop HR in so everything is handled properly." I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, but I made sure to look right at Dad and Jenna when I said it. The color drained from Jenna's face, and Dad's grin faltered. That was the first move. They expected me to either lash out and look unstable or to swallow it and say nothing. I gave them neither. I gave them process, which is far more dangerous than anger when it is aimed correctly. The rest of the dinner limped along, but the energy had changed. Mom tried to pivot the conversation to vacations, but the tension was still thick. Jenna barely spoke another word, and Dad looked irritated that his star daughter moment had fizzled. I just kept smiling politely, counting down until I could finally leave. Inside, though, I was already building the outline of what I needed to do, gather the receipts, protect my review, and make sure that any move she tried to make would collapse under its own weight. When the night ended and I finally got home, my phone buzzed with a text from my boss. It was short, but it said everything I needed, loop HR, put everything in writing. I will back clean process. That was the moment I realized I was no longer on defense. The rules of the game had changed. I had an ally who valued facts over noise, and my sister had just walked herself into a spotlight that would expose more than she ever intended. And the best part? They thought I was still sitting there, smiling politely, letting it all slide. They had no idea the trap had already started to close. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with that tight knot in my chest that usually means I will either overreact and regret it or underreact and hate myself later. So I decided to choose the third path I have learned to trust. which is the one where I do not raise my voice. I just raise the standard, and I do it in writing so no one has to guess what happened or when it happened. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and began pulling every piece of material that mattered into one place. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I know how quickly stories get rewritten when people feel embarrassed. And I was not going to let this turn into another family tale about me being dramatic while my sister was simply ambitious. I exported the original slide decks I had created for last quarter's planning session. I pulled the draft memos I had sent to my boss with timestamps that matched the calendar invites. And I copied the exact phrasing I had used in the notes column, where I keep my reminders about which terms we use internally and which ones we never put in external documents. Because those phrases end up being fingerprints when someone tries to pass our work off as their own, and I had a feeling those fingerprints were about to matter. I wrote a clean email to my boss and our HR partner, kept the subject line boring on purpose, and laid out the timeline in simple paragraphs that included dates, recipients, and attachments. And I did not add commentary about family, because I wanted the facts to stand on their own feet without leaning on my frustration. When I hit send, I felt my shoulders drop a little, not because anything was solved yet, but because the center of gravity had shifted from feelings to policy, and that is the ground where I am strongest. HR replied quickly, thanked me for the clarity, and pointed me to the conflict of interest rule that covers relatives requesting favors, back-channel access, or informal referrals that bypass our published process. And the language was firm in a way that calmed me, since it required all candidates to enter through the same portal and be measured by the same rubric, with any relationship declared upfront and documented, and any materials reviewed by more than one person. My boss forwarded, with permission, the 2 messages Jenna had sent him, and I read them slowly, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, until I reached a line that used a phrase I had coined for an internal workshop. A phrase that had never been in a public blog post or a slide on LinkedIn, and right then my patience stopped feeling noble and started feeling naive. I took a breath, opened the family chat, and typed a single sentence that I reread 3 times before hitting send, because I wanted it to be calm and impossible to twist. I wrote that I had looped HR to make sure everything about hiring stayed professional, that it was not personal, and that work would follow policy the same way taxes follow the calendar, and I ended it there without a winking face or a passive-aggressive question. The replies came fast and messy, with Dad asking if I was really going to make this into a thing, with Jenna suggesting we keep work and family separate, which made me laugh out loud in a very unkind way that I did not send, and with Mom dropping a peacekeeping message about how we were both talented and should support each other, which I appreciated even though it had nothing to do with the actual problem. I muted the thread for 8 hours and went back to my document. If I was going to be accused of being territorial, then my territory was going to be clearly marked and fairly managed, so I drafted a neutral screening rubric for any candidate touching my team's projects. And I wrote it like a checklist a reasonable stranger could pass with preparation, not a trap only I could unlock, and I included criteria that aligned with the job description we had published last season, not the inflated wish list everyone throws around in meetings when they want to sound visionary. I added the rubric to our team wiki with a brief note that the hiring portal would require it as step 1 for any applicant, internal or external, and I tagged HR so there would be a record of when it went live and who approved it. And then I moved my personal docs to a tighter folder with sharing turned off for anyone who did not need access that week. By midday, my boss pinged me for a quick call, and he kept his voice even while he told me he respected how I was handling it and that he would back whatever HR recommended. But he also added that he had noticed a pattern over the last year where my work would surface in odd places before it was officially public, and he asked if I had ever confronted Jenna about borrowing language, and I told him that I had not. Because in our family, borrowing is framed as helping and pointing out boundaries is framed as being difficult, and I was not interested in another emotional debate that went nowhere. He told me that HR was reviewing the 2 messages and that we should sit tight until they came back with next steps, and I thanked him for the heads up, because clear expectations are worth more than sympathy when you are standing in a crosswind. The HR email landed late afternoon, and it was measured in that careful way that means the situation is now bigger than anyone's personal feelings, and it asked for confirmation of authorship on certain phrases in my materials, which I provided with version history screenshots, and it asked whether I had ever shared those materials outside the approved channels, which I had not, and it noted that parts of Jenna's resume used internal project names in a way that could be misleading, which meant they needed to schedule a recorded call to clarify her claims and to document the provenance of the language she had sent. I stared at the screen for a long minute, feeling both vindicated and tired, because I did not want my sister dragged. I just wanted the game to stop, and maybe this was the only way it ever stops, not through a tearful heart-to-heart, but through a calendar invite with a compliance checkbox that says we record. Before I shut the laptop, I added one last move that felt small but important, which was to disconnect Jenna from my professional networks where she could see my drafts or my calendar notes, not out of spite, but out of basic hygiene. And I posted a short update on the team wiki that we were tightening access to planning docs during review season, which had the added benefit of protecting the rest of the team from casual leaks that always seem harmless until they are not. I did not announce any of this to my family, and I did not send a screenshot to prove I was not overreacting, because the point was not to win a debate. The point was to make sure the next steps would not depend on anyone's mood. When I finally unmuted my phone that evening, there were more messages I chose not to open, because the rail turn had already happened elsewhere, and it was sitting in my inbox with a calendar link and a subject line that made my stomach flip while my jaw set. A simple line that said HR would like to schedule a recorded clarification regarding materials and claims, and in that moment I knew the story had crossed the line between family noise and professional record, and that whatever happened next would not be about who could talk louder at a dinner table, but about what survives when the facts are read out loud and time-stamped. By the time the recorded call was scheduled, I had already rehearsed in my head a dozen different outcomes, because I know that nothing makes a situation more dangerous than walking into it unprepared. And this one had the potential to turn into a mess where I would either look vindictive or disloyal, depending on which angle someone wanted to push. I decided that the smartest move was not to argue, not to editorialize, and not to waste time trying to convince anyone of what I knew. Instead, I would simply make sure that every piece of evidence lined up so cleanly that the truth would reveal itself without me needing to say more than a few factual confirmations. HR thrives on clarity and compliance, and I knew if I gave them both, they would have no choice but to side with process over personality. In the days leading up to the call, I did something I had never done before, something that felt both ruthless and necessary. I created a decoy document. It was not malicious in the sense of sabotage, but it was crafted with enough of a twist that anyone copying from it would expose themselves immediately. I took some of my older research notes, adjusted the formatting to make them look like a fresh project outline, and tucked inside a few deliberate phrases that sounded impressive, but were not actually used in our current strategy. I uploaded it into a private folder and waited, because I suspected my sister had already been looking for shortcuts in places she should not have been, and if she tried it again, this would prove it. When the call day arrived, it was my boss, the HR partner, Jenna, and me. The whole thing was recorded, with HR stating at the beginning that the purpose was to clarify authorship of materials and to ensure compliance with our referral and application process. I sat quietly while Jenna introduced herself in that polished, eager tone she always uses when she wants to charm authority figures. She talked about how she had been inspired by some of the frameworks she had researched and thought they could add value to the company. My boss gave nothing away, just nodded politely, but when HR asked her to expand on one of the frameworks, she recited, almost word for word, a line from the decoy document. I did not flinch, but inside I felt a cold kind of certainty, the kind you get when a suspicion hardens into proof. HR asked where she had come across that phrasing, and she hesitated for just a beat too long before saying she had seen similar concepts online. My boss glanced at me, not with anger but with that look that says, "We both know what just happened, but let the record show it first." I stayed silent until HR turned to me and asked directly whether the phrase was part of our official strategy. I replied calmly, "No, it is not. That phrasing does not exist in our current or past approved documents. It appears only in a private draft folder that is not public. HR wrote something down and thanked me for the clarification. The call ended with HR informing Jenna that her application could not move forward until the provenance of her materials was fully reviewed, and that any further communication would need to go through the formal portal, not directly to my boss. Jenna's smile was gone by then, replaced by the tightness she usually reserves for me when she thinks I have humiliated her. But I had not humiliated her. I had simply set the rules in place and let her own choices expose the truth. After the call, I drafted a short memo and sent it to HR and my boss. It was not dramatic, just a clear outline of the timeline, the overlap in language, and the risk of internal information being misrepresented. At the end, I included a simple request that my upcoming performance review be formally insulated from family-related interference, and that all future referrals from relatives be flagged automatically for compliance. I kept it professional because I did not need them to see me angry. I needed them to see me precise. Within an hour, HR replied that my request was reasonable and would be logged as part of the ongoing review. That evening, Dad called me, and the tone in his voice was already confrontational. He asked me why I would embarrass my sister like that, and whether I understood that family should come before corporate rules. I listened quietly, because I knew anything I said in anger would only feed his narrative that I was cold and ungrateful. When he paused, I simply told him she made a choice. I did not force her to send those documents. All I did was make sure the process was fair. He scoffed and muttered something about me always thinking I was better than Jenna, then hung up. Oddly enough, I did not feel shaken by that call the way I once would have. Instead, I felt lighter because I had finally stopped letting their definitions of loyalty trap me into silence. Loyalty is not covering up for someone else's bad decisions, especially when those decisions put my own career at risk. Loyalty, to me, is about being consistent with my principles, even when it is uncomfortable. And for once, HR agreed with me, not with him. Later that night, my boss sent me another message. It was brief, but it said more than I expected. Good job today. Facts speak louder than noise. That line stuck with me because it confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear from someone who mattered in my professional world. This was no longer a family spat. This was a compliance issue, and I had handled it exactly as the system expected. As I closed my laptop and let myself finally relax, I realized that I was no longer dreading the next confrontation. The trap had already closed, clean and undeniable, and from here on out, every attempt my sister made to claw her way into my space would only tighten it further. I had not shouted, I had not begged, and I had not stooped to her tactics. I had simply set the rules, waited, and let the truth surface on its own. And that, more than anything else, was the kind of revenge that could not be undone. Once the call with HR ended and the decoy trap had done its work, I thought maybe the storm would quiet down on its own. But if there is one thing I should have known by now, it is that my father cannot leave a game unfinished when he feels like his favorite player has lost. A few days later, he called me again, only this time there was no attempt at small talk or soft landing, just his voice, sharp and clipped, asking me why I could not be more gracious and give Jenna another chance. He hinted that he had spoken to someone on the board of our company, a golf buddy he apparently brags to every weekend, and that maybe this person could smooth things over if I stopped making everything so formal. I felt the old frustration boiling up in me, the years of being asked to be smaller so that Jenna could shine brighter, but instead of snapping, I wrote down every word he said in a notebook I keep for exactly this reason. Because I have learned that when family meddles in business, the only protection you have is documentation. I did not argue with him on the call. I simply told him that would be a governance issue, and I made my tone as flat as possible so he could not twist it into drama. He grew frustrated and told me that I was impossible, that no one in the family understood why I had to be so rigid, and then he hung up before I could respond. I closed the notebook and immediately drafted a short email to HR, attaching a summary of the conversation, with dates and the note that my father had mentioned possible board contact. I sent it off without emotion, just like every other step in this process, because I wanted them to see that I was not panicking, I was simply keeping the trail clean. My boss, who had clearly grown tired of the family noise spilling into his inbox, invited me to do a knowledge-sharing session with the team that week. He said it would be useful for newer staff to understand the frameworks I had been building, but I could tell it was also his way of giving me the stage to show my actual value without the distraction of family drama. I agreed, and I spent 2 evenings polishing my slides, not with anything flashy, but with solid data and outcomes that spoke louder than anything I could say. The session went smoothly, with thoughtful questions from colleagues and clear recognition from my boss, and when it ended, he thanked me publicly for the clarity I had brought to the team's direction. That was a moment I decided to capture, because reputations are built on visible results, not whispered complaints. When I got home, I asked my mom if she would be willing to watch the recording, since she often hears only my father's side of things. She hesitated, but eventually agreed, and later that night she texted me that she had watched it, that she was proud of me, and that she wished Dad would see me the way others clearly did. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling both grateful and sad, because while her words meant a lot, they also revealed just how deep the gap in our family had grown. The next week, I accepted a speaking slot at an industry group, one I had been putting off because I was tired and did not feel like putting myself out there. This time, though, I realized it was not just about me anymore. It was about showing that I could stand on my own work without my family dragging the story behind me. I gave a talk on governance and compliance in mid-sized companies, thanked HR for their clarity in setting guardrails, and left the stage knowing I had not only reinforced my credibility, but also closed the door on anyone trying to paint me as unstable or difficult. When I got back to my desk, I copied the link to the internal recording of my team session and posted it in the family chat with one plain line. Thought you would like to see what I actually do. I did not add sarcasm or anger, just the link. The group went silent for hours, which in our family chat is louder than any insult. Eventually, Jenna sent a single heart emoji, which I ignored because it did not change anything. The point was not to win her approval, it was to stop letting them control the narrative of who I am and what I contribute. The most unexpected moment came 2 days later, when I received a LinkedIn message from a recruiter who had attended the industry talk. She said she was impressed with my presentation and wanted to discuss a role at another firm, one that would be 2 levels higher than my current position and pay significantly more. I did not rush to respond, but I felt a sense of power settle into me, because suddenly the stakes were no longer about just defending what I had, but about deciding what I wanted next. The possibility of leaving on my own terms, with leverage in hand, turned this from a defensive battle into something much larger. That evening, as I scrolled through the unopened messages in the family chat, I realized how much had changed in just a few weeks. They had expected me to play the role I always had, the quiet one who would either swallow it or explode and then apologize. Instead, I had shifted the stage, moved the fight into a place where opinions did not matter, only records and results. My father could argue, Jenna could pout, my mother could mediate, but none of that carried weight against the undeniable proof of what I had built and the opportunities it had attracted. I sat back that night, looking at the recruiter's message, and thought about how satisfying it was to know that no matter what happened next, I had already flipped the room. For once, the story was not theirs to tell, it was mine. And I had every intention of finishing it on my own terms. The message from the recruiter was not a fantasy or a hypothetical invitation to talk at some vague point in the future. It was a detailed outline of a role that matched the scope I had already been covering for more than a year, with a title that finally named the level of decision-making I actually held, and while the compensation made my eyebrows lift, it was the quiet respect in the way she described their expectations, clear authority, measurable outcomes, no tolerance for backchannel nonsense, that made me sit up straighter and decide I would not let this moment pass without testing the strength of everything I had built during the past weeks. I answered her politely, asked for the formal brief, and then sent a separate note to my boss and HR requesting a meeting to discuss next steps regarding the conflict review, my performance cycle, and the structural question of scope versus title. Because I knew that timing is leverage and that the cleanest wins happen when you do not hide your hand, but also do not play it with theatrics. We met the next afternoon, and I walked in with a folder that was both simple and devastating: the timeline of the dinner, the documented outreach, the decoy catch, the HR call summary, and a one-page sheet listing the responsibilities I had quietly taken on over the last 4 quarters with the cost savings and revenue impacts attached, which I had kept updated precisely for moments like this, when anyone might ask whether my impact was real or just a story I told to myself on hard days. I said plainly that I had an external opportunity at 2 levels up that would expect exactly what I was already delivering, and that I preferred to stay if my company wanted me in the seat that matched my contribution, but that I would not remain under a title that let other people frame my work as optional or easy to poach, especially by relatives who believed their proximity to me meant proximity to my outcomes. HR listened without interrupting. My boss nodded in places I expected, and when I finished, he said he would like to counter with an accelerated promotion and a retention bonus conditioned on a few governance items that he believed would protect both me and the team. The governance items mattered more than the money, and I said so directly, because I knew if we did not codify boundaries, then all of this would repeat under a different costume the next time my father decided that Jenna's life would be brighter if mine were dimmer. We drafted, right there in the room, language that insulated my performance review from family or personal acquaintances, required any family-sourced referrals to be flagged and handled by HR without my involvement, and established that any attempt to influence my role through external board or investor channels would be logged and escalated as a compliance issue rather than a managerial preference. And while it felt surreal to negotiate rules that should have been obvious from the start, it also felt like finally building the door that keeps the weather out instead of just mopping the floor after every storm. I accepted the promotion in principle, pending the final paperwork, and I gave them a reasonable but firm deadline. Because I had an outside offer in writing, and deadlines, like handrails, stop people from pretending there are infinite stairs. That night, my father called again, and he sounded less triumphant than tired, as if the game had lost its fun now that there were referees and a scoreboard everyone could see, but he still tried one last angle, asking whether all this structure was really necessary and whether I could remember that family is supposed to forgive, and I took a breath and told him that forgiveness is not the same as access, that I can love people without handing them my keys, and that if Jenna wanted a future in the world I operate in, she could start where everyone else starts, with an application, a screening, and earned outcomes, not with my name on her resume and my work in her drafts. He went quiet long enough that I thought he might hang up again, but when he spoke his voice was softer, and he said that maybe he had pushed too hard, and I told him that pushing was not the problem, the erasing was, and that I was done being erased even if it made me unpopular at holiday dinners. The paperwork arrived at noon 2 days later, and I read every line carefully the way people only do after they have been burned, and there it was in black and white: the promotion title, the compensation, the governance clause that locked the door I had needed for years, and the HR sign-off that would outlive anyone's moods or golf buddies. I signed, returned the documents, and then did something I never thought I would do. I wrote to the recruiter and thanked her for the offer, explained that I had leveraged it to secure what I needed where I am, and told her that I would be happy to stay in touch, because even when you win, you should not slam the window that taught you could open it. She replied with a gracious note that said she respected the move and would reach out again if something even bigger appeared, and I saved it in a folder called Future, because I like reminders that I have options. When the promotion announcement went out internally, my boss framed it around outcomes and governance rather than personalities, which I appreciated more than he probably knows, because it signaled to everyone that this was not a pity lift or a political tidy-up, but the formal recognition of what had already been true for months. And while the congratulations notes came in, I resisted the urge to post or brag, and instead sent a short message to the family chat that said I had accepted a new role at my company and would not be discussing work matters there anymore, and that if anyone had questions about referrals, they should read the public policy. And then I muted the thread and put my phone face down, because victory does not become more real by being displayed. Later that evening, Jenna texted me privately with a message that avoided apologies, but acknowledged the obvious by saying she understood that lines had been crossed and that she would not contact my boss again. And even though it was not the statement I once dreamed of hearing, it was enough, because I was done needing a confession to believe what I already knew. My mother sent a quiet note saying she had watched my team talk for a second time and that she was proud of me, and my father did not post anything in the chat at all, which, for once, felt better than any backhanded compliment he could have managed. I poured a glass of water, sat at my table, and let the quiet settle in around me, not as a dramatic ending or a cinematic fade-out, but as the ordinary stillness you get when a long, noisy pattern finally stops. And I thought about how simple the final move had been when you stripped it of all the emotion. I stopped arguing, I wrote things down, I built a clean case, I demanded terms that matched my value. And I chose the outcome that protected my future rather than feeding an old story. I did not set out to teach anyone a lesson, but the lesson landed anyway, because the proof was undeniable and the doors were locked in the right places, and as I turned off the light I felt something I had not felt on a birthday in years. Which was not triumph or spite but control, the kind that lets you sleep without rehearsing all the ways you might have handled it better, because for once I handled it exactly right, and I won.